It's suspenseful, emotionally charged, and perfect for grabbing attention in the first few seconds of a video. The office was unusually quiet that afternoon. The hum of fluorescent lights and the distant tapping of keyboards filled the background. But there was a calm, almost intimate stillness in the room I was led into. The door closed softly behind me, and I noticed how the sunlight slanted through the large window, washing the office in golden warmth. She moved gracefully across the room, every step measured yet fluid, the faint scent of her perfume trailing in the air. A subtle mix of floral and something musky, comforting yet compelling. She reached for the curtains and, with a careful sweep, closed them, dimming the harsh glare and leaving the space bathed in a soft amber glow. Her hands lingered for a moment on the fabric, the slight tension in her shoulders hinting at some hidden thought, or perhaps a hesitation she wasn't ready to voice. The movement was ordinary, mundane even, yet there was something in it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something about the way she commanded the space without a word, quietly drawing me into it. She turned then, her dark eyes meeting mine with a measured intensity that made me pause. She was beautiful in a way that went beyond surface appearance. Every movement, every tilt of her head, carried an understated confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from experience, from having faced life's challenges and emerged intact, tempered by a quiet vulnerability that made her human, approachable, real. She wore a tailored cream blouse and navy slacks, and the light caught the subtle shimmer of the silk fabric. Her long black hair fell over one shoulder, catching the golden sunlight and framing her face in soft, deliberate waves. "Sit," she said, her voice calm, slightly warm, yet carrying an authority I didn't question. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation, though tinged with some unknown purpose that made my heart rate quicken without reason. The word hung in the air, almost echoing in the soft quiet, and I obeyed, stepping toward the chair opposite her. The polished wood of the floor was cool under my shoes, the space between us small enough that the warmth of the sunlight seemed shared, but large enough to maintain boundaries. As I lowered myself into the chair, my attention kept returning to small details. The subtle way her fingers rested on the edge of the desk, the slight catch of her breath when she shifted her weight, the way her eyes never left mine for longer than a heartbeat before looking away, as if she were both inviting me closer and protecting herself. There was tension, yes, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was magnetic, quiet, and carefully measured, the kind of tension that grows slowly, building anticipation and curiosity. In that dimmed office, with sunlight softened by closed curtains, and with her poised yet approachable presence, it felt like the world outside had ceased to exist. Every sound was muted except for the soft rustle of fabric and the faint creak of the chair beneath me. I was aware of her in a way that went beyond mere observation. I was attuned to the energy she carried, the unspoken words hovering in the quiet space, and the subtle invitation to see beyond the professional mask she wore. And as I settled into my seat, I realized this wasn't just an ordinary meeting. Something had shifted. The ordinary had become charged with possibility, and even in the silence, her presence was commanding, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. The chair beneath me felt slightly too solid, grounding me in a space that suddenly seemed charged with expectation. The room was quiet, but the quiet wasn't empty. It hummed with subtle tension, the kind that made every small sound, like the soft click of her pen on the desk or the faint shuffle of papers, feel significant. I watched her move across the room, adjusting a stack of folders, and it was impossible not to notice the grace in her gestures. She wore a fitted cream blouse tucked neatly into navy slacks, the subtle sheen of silk catching the warm light filtering through the curtains she had closed. Her long black hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves, and the dimmed sunlight highlighted the faint laugh lines at the corners of her dark brown eyes. She was 40, yes, but every movement carried a quiet confidence that made her presence magnetic. She handed me a document, and for a moment our fingers brushed. The contact was brief, but the warmth lingered in a way that made me acutely aware of the space between us. It was startling how something so minor, a touch meant to be professional, could carry such unspoken weight. She didn't look at me immediately, her gaze drifting toward the window even though the curtains were drawn, as if she were thinking about something beyond the office walls. I kept my eyes on her, noticing the subtle ways she fidgeted with her pen, the slight shift of her shoulders, the way her lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile that hinted at unspoken amusement or private thought. There was a peculiar intimacy in the silence. I could feel it in the warm afternoon light, in the faint scent of her perfume, in the soft rustle of papers as she rearranged them. My hands rested on my knees, but I could feel a tension building, subtle but insistent. Her eyes found mine for a fraction of a second, just enough to send a shiver of awareness through me, before she looked away, deliberately returning her focus to the task at hand. The unspoken rules of professionalism clashed beautifully with the undeniable electricity in the air, making every shared glance, every brief touch feel charged with possibility. As I absorbed the scene, I realized that the silence wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. It was as if she were testing me, measuring my patience, my attentiveness, my sensitivity to the subtle cues she offered. And I was equally conscious of the same unspoken game. The way her presence made my heart rate quicken, the way the faintest brush of her fingers against mine left a lingering warmth, the way her steady gaze seemed to invite connection without demanding it. The hum of the office, the distant sounds of typing and distant footsteps, faded into the background. All that mattered was this quiet, intimate bubble we had created, where words weren't necessary to communicate attention, curiosity, or even something that might grow into desire. Every small gesture, every fleeting glance, carried meaning. And in that weighty silence, I realized that this was no ordinary interaction. Something had shifted between us. The room, dimmed and hushed, had become a private space where the mundane, the document, the desk, the chairs, transformed into instruments of connection, anticipation, and unspoken communication. I was aware of her in every detail, and in turn, she seemed acutely aware of me, the tension between us suspended delicately like sunlight through curtains, both illuminating and hiding what neither of us was ready to say. The quiet between us stretched, neither rushed to fill it, yet it no longer felt tense, only expectant. She reached for a document on her desk, and as she did, the light caught her hair, long and black, cascading over her shoulder like a silken curtain. At 40, she carried herself with a confidence shaped by years of experience, but in that small movement, there was a subtle vulnerability, a fleeting openness that made her human beyond her professional poise. Her dark brown eyes, framed by faint laugh lines, met mine for a moment, and in them, there was something almost unspoken. Trust, curiosity, maybe a hint of invitation. She spoke then, softly, her voice calm and measured, but with an undertone of warmth. The words were simple, almost mundane. A brief story about a challenging client, a minor miscommunication that had left her feeling exhausted that morning. But in the way she delivered it, there was honesty, an openness I hadn't expected. It wasn't dramatic or confessional, but it was real, and in that authenticity something shifted. I leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on my knees, silently listening. Every subtle gesture she made, the tilt of her head, the brushing back of her hair, the slight squeeze of the pen between her fingers, added layers to her story that words alone couldn't convey. Her vulnerability was small, yet it resonated profoundly. I found myself sharing a small anecdote in return, something light, something personal but safe, feeling the tension of professional distance soften. The room felt warmer, not just from the soft afternoon light filtered through the closed curtains, but from the quiet intimacy forming between us. There was a rhythm emerging. Her words, my attentive listening, the gentle interchange of glances, the small, meaningful movements that neither of us could entirely control. At one point, as she leaned over the desk to point out a detail in the document, our knees brushed under the table. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it carried a quiet electricity. My pulse quickened, but the moment was so subtle, so natural, that it could have passed unnoticed to anyone else. She didn't recoil or shy away. Instead, she lingered just slightly longer, and in that infinitesimal pause, something unspoken was communicated. A connection had been acknowledged without a single word directly stating it. The air was filled with faint sounds. The soft click of her pen, the rustle of paper, the distant murmur of colleagues outside. But it was as though we existed in a small bubble of heightened awareness. I noticed the delicate curve of her lips when she smiled faintly, the gentle sweep of her hand over the desk, the way her posture shifted subtly when she laughed at a small joke I offered. Each detail drew me in, emphasizing the slow, simmering tension and the growing emotional intimacy. By the time she leaned back slightly in her chair, dark brown eyes meeting mine with that quiet, open vulnerability, I realized this wasn't just a professional interaction. Something deeper was stirring, an unspoken acknowledgement of trust, shared understanding, and perhaps the very beginning of something more. The subtle confession of vulnerability had opened a door, and both of us were aware, silently, that crossing its threshold might change everything between us. She moved slightly closer to show a detail on the document, and suddenly, the space between us felt smaller, charged in a way that had been simmering beneath the surface all afternoon. Her hand, delicate yet confident, brushed lightly over my wrist as she passed the paper, an unintentional gesture that sent a jolt through me. The touch was so brief and subtle that it could have gone unnoticed, yet I felt it keenly, the warmth lingering as though it had left a mark. Her dark brown eyes met mine for a heartbeat, then shifted to the document. But the intensity in that brief glance left a fluttering weight in my chest that I couldn't ignore. She leaned over the desk, pointing at a line with her pen, and the proximity made my awareness of her presence almost overwhelming. Her long black hair fell slightly forward, brushing against her shoulder, catching the golden afternoon light filtered through the closed curtains. At 40, her beauty was composed yet magnetic. Her lightly tanned skin and subtle freckles, the graceful curve of her posture, the faint laugh lines that softened her expressions. She radiated an effortless elegance, and in that small, intimate moment, the room felt smaller, warmer, more private than it had a minute before. The air between us was charged, though neither of us spoke of it. The subtle, accidental contact of hands, the shared space under the desk, the quiet rustle of papers. It all seemed amplified. My attention was drawn to every detail. The soft click of her pen as she set it down, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders with each breath, the slight tilt of her head that suggested curiosity or amusement. Even the faint scent of her perfume, the mingling of floral and musk, was magnified in the intimacy of the dimmed office. I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear or embarrassment, but from the unspoken connection growing between us. She didn't pull away from the accidental contact. If anything, she lingered just slightly longer than necessary. That hesitation, so subtle, spoke volumes. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the moment meant something to both of us, even if neither dared to name it aloud. Her eyes flickered to mine again, soft and knowing, and I noticed the faint curve of her lips, the subtle warmth in her gaze. There was a tension in the room, yes, but it was not uncomfortable. It was magnetic, inviting, an unspoken dance of proximity and restraint. Every minor gesture, the brushing of her hair behind her ear, the slight sway of her hand, the careful alignment of the document, carried emotional weight, and I felt acutely attuned to it all. Even as she straightened, returning to her chair, the lingering closeness remained in the space between us. The warmth of her touch, though fleeting, stayed with me. The flutter in my chest, the awareness of her presence, and the intensity of her quiet observation created a sense of intimacy that went beyond words. In that dimmed office, with the golden light casting gentle shadows, the first real, meaningful contact between us was made. Not loud or dramatic, but quiet, deliberate, and unforgettable. It was the first time the invisible boundary between professional and personal blurred, and it left a delicious tension that promised much more if either of us dared to step closer. A quiet laugh broke the stillness, soft and unexpectedly warm, echoing lightly in the dimmed office. It came from her, the 40-year-old American Caucasian secretary, her long black hair falling in gentle waves over her shoulders, lightly tanned skin catching the filtered sunlight, subtle freckles and soft laugh lines around her dark brown eyes adding a touch of vulnerability to her confident presence. She was wearing a cream blouse tucked into navy slacks, her posture poised yet relaxed, exuding a natural, graceful authority. I found myself caught off guard by the ease and humanity in that small laugh. It wasn't forced or performative. It was genuine, and it rippled through me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The source of her amusement was a misfiled document I had mistakenly handed her earlier. It was a small, trivial error, but the way she tilted her head, eyes crinkling in amusement, and let out that gentle laugh, made it feel like a shared secret, a small bubble of connection in the middle of our professional environment. I returned a sheepish grin, and in that moment, the tension that had been building between us seemed to soften just enough to make room for warmth. Her smile lingered, small and knowing, like she was granting me access to something ordinarily reserved for a more personal space. As we straightened the papers together, our hands brushed lightly, once, twice, just barely enough to be noticed. Each accidental touch carried a silent acknowledgement of the chemistry building in the quiet office. The warmth of her fingers, the soft hum of her movement, the faint scent of her perfume blending with the air. It all made the environment feel intimate and yet entirely appropriate, safe in its slow unfolding. I noticed the way her dark eyes followed my movements, curious and amused, the subtle rise of her eyebrows hinting at playful judgment, and I realized that humor had a power of its own. It allowed us to bridge the invisible divide, to play with proximity, and to explore the attraction growing between us without words. Her laughter faded into a soft smile, and she tilted her head toward me, allowing a small, teasing comment about my clumsiness with the files. It wasn't flirtatious in an obvious way. It was natural, warm, and lighthearted. But beneath the playful exterior, there was an undertone of something deeper, a subtle invitation to connect. I felt the pulse of our shared energy, the delicate balance of professional distance and personal curiosity, making the air between us almost electric in its understated way. Even the smallest gestures, the way her hand lingered on a paper, the way she leaned slightly toward me to explain a detail, the tiny sparkle in her eyes, carried more meaning than any words could. The golden light from the dimmed curtains caught the edges of her hair, glinting softly, illuminating her mature beauty, and I couldn't help but notice how her confidence and vulnerability existed side by side, quietly powerful. By the time we had straightened the last of the misfiled documents, the office no longer felt like a place of routine work. It had transformed into a space of subtle intimacy, playful tension, and shared amusement. There was no rush, no pressure, just the gentle, growing awareness of each other's presence, the quiet thrill of unspoken attraction, and the promise of something more lingering in the warm, filtered sunlight. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer, enclosing the space in a quiet tension that neither of us wanted to break. She paused near the door, the 40-year-old American Latina secretary, long black hair cascading over her shoulders, dark brown eyes scanning the room with a mixture of authority and subtle vulnerability. Her lightly tanned skin and graceful posture made her presence both commanding and approachable, a rare balance that drew attention without demanding it. At 40, she carried herself with a mature, effortless beauty, soft laugh lines around her eyes, a curvy figure that moved with quiet elegance, and a calm, measured confidence that contrasted with the faint hesitations she now displayed. I could feel my own pulse quicken, acutely aware of the shared energy in the room. The documents lay scattered across the desk, yet all focus had shifted away from them. Her gaze met mine, lingering longer than expected, and for a fleeting second, it felt like the world had narrowed to the space between us. Her hand hovered near the doorknob, pausing as though caught between leaving and staying. That hesitation spoke volumes. A mixture of professional boundaries, personal restraint, and something deeper, unspoken, that simmered just beneath the surface. Every small detail drew me in. The faint scent of her perfume, warm and subtly floral, seemed more pronounced in the quiet office. The soft rustle of her blouse as she adjusted her posture, the gentle exhale as if weighing her next move, the careful way her fingers traced the edge of the desk. All of it created a heightened awareness, a slow-burning intimacy that felt as much emotional as physical. Even the sunlight spilling softly through the closed curtains seemed charged, highlighting the contours of her face, the slight smile playing at the corners of her lips, the way her dark eyes glimmered with curiosity and caution. I shifted slightly in my seat, conscious of every breath, every micro-movement between us. The tug of attraction was undeniable, but it was tempered by respect, by the knowledge that this moment existed in a fragile balance. I wanted to speak, to bridge the gap, yet words felt both necessary and impossible. Every heartbeat was loud in the quiet room, echoing with the tension that had been building since she had closed the curtains. It was a silent dialogue. Her pauses, her subtle gestures, the faint quiver in her fingers, all communicating a desire to connect while also maintaining control. She finally moved toward the door, but not in haste. Her steps were measured, deliberate, and as she turned, her gaze found mine again. The unspoken question hung in the air. What could we say, what could we do, without crossing a line we weren't ready to acknowledge? I realized then that this was the emotional peak of our encounter, the point where anticipation, desire, and hesitation collided in a quiet, almost painful clarity. Even as she opened the door, the tension remained. Her presence had imprinted itself on the space. Her subtle touches, her lingering glances, the quiet moments of shared vulnerability, all leaving me aware that something profound had begun. And in that delicate, conflicted moment, I understood that the connection we had forged, though restrained, was far from over. She closed the office door softly behind her, the faint click resonating in the quiet space, leaving me alone with the lingering warmth of her presence. The sunlight filtered through the curtains she had drawn earlier, casting a gentle amber glow over the desk, the scattered documents, and the chair where I still sat. The office felt smaller now, charged with the subtle tension and intimacy of everything that had transpired. The faint scent of her perfume remained, floral with an earthy undertone, a silent reminder of the closeness we had shared in those fleeting moments. I leaned back in my chair, the polished wood cool beneath my fingertips, and replayed the interaction in my mind. Each gesture, each lingering glance, each accidental brush of fingers had built a tapestry of quiet connection that defied words. Her long black hair, the way it caught the golden light, the soft laugh lines around her dark brown eyes, the slightly tanned skin, and the elegant curve of her posture. All of it lingered in my awareness, as if the office itself remembered her presence. The moment had not been dramatic. There had been no overt declarations or bold confessions, only subtle, deliberate exchanges. The way she had moved, the soft tilt of her head, the faint curve of her lips when she smiled, the careful attention in her gaze. It was in these small, almost imperceptible details that the depth of our connection had been revealed. And yet, even as I reflected, I realized that the silence left behind was not emptiness. It was potential. The tension, the trust, the warmth we had shared created an invisible thread linking us, waiting to be acknowledged in the future. I ran my fingers over the edge of the desk, imagining the light brush of her hand, the warmth that had lingered on my wrist, the brief contact that had sent a jolt through me. Her presence had a gravity, not demanding but drawing attention, inviting reflection. I realized how much I had noticed. The way she had shared a hint of personal vulnerability, the careful modulation of her voice, the humor that had broken the tension just enough to make the atmosphere human and approachable. Each layer of observation made me feel closer to her, even in her absence. And yet, the most remarkable part was the restraint. There had been no rush, no need to push boundaries, no overt declarations of desire. Instead, the interaction had been measured, tender, and respectful. A slow, deliberate unfolding that left space for reflection, imagination, and quiet longing. The intimacy was not loud or obvious. It was subtle, profound, and emotionally resonant. I sat in the warm glow of the afternoon, aware that the office no longer felt ordinary. It had become a place of connection, where humor, vulnerability, and subtle gestures had intertwined to create something meaningful. The quiet resolution of our interaction was not an ending, but a gentle pause, a moment of reflection, a warm memory to carry forward. I understood then that the bond we had forged, though restrained and unspoken, was real, and that its potential stretched far beyond the walls of that small office, waiting patiently for the next encounter, for the next glance, for the next quiet moment shared in silence.